Alrighty, happy July 1st. We are looking at congruent polygons today. We are starting our congruent triangle unit, and we're going to be proving congruent triangles, but we need to focus more today on just specifically what does it mean for two polygons, or we're going to focus on triangles mainly. What does it mean if they're congruent? Okay, so we have a congruence statement, which is this right here. It tells us which shape is congruent to which shape. This statement is very, very important because the order of the letters tells you which part is congruent. So when it says to mark all the corresponding sides and angles, you have to use the order of the letters to decide. So AB and BA, that means this side right here is congruent to itself. If I go next, BC, AK, that tells me that side BC is congruent to side AK. And then first and third, AC, BK, tells me that those two sides are congruent. And notice I marked each pair differently. This is called a reflexive side when it's shared, so I usually just put a little X. You don't have to do an X, but I do. This pair of sides I did 1 tick mark, and this pair of sides I did 2 tick marks. Okay. Then in this triangle, angle A is congruent to, in this triangle, angle B. So I did 1 arc, 1 arc. In this triangle, angle B is congruent to, in this triangle, angle A. So I did 2 arcs, 2 arcs. And in this triangle, angle C is congruent to, in this triangle, angle K. So I did 3 arcs, 3 arcs. So the order of the letters tells you which pieces are congruent to each other. Alright, so here again, the order of the letters. This tells us that side RS is congruent to side XV. So I did 1 tick mark each. The next 2 letters tell us side SQ is congruent to side VQ. So I did 2 tick marks each. And then if you go on the outside, side RQ is congruent to side XQ. So I did each of those with 3 tick marks. The letters tell you angle R is congruent to angle X. So I did 1 arc on each. Angle S is congruent to angle V. So I did 2 arcs on each. And then the angle Q's in each of the triangles are congruent, so I did 3 arcs each. So that's using the congruent statement to mark all the sides and angles congruent. Alright, so example 2, list the 6 pairs of corresponding congruent parts, then write a congruent statement. So we've talked about congruent shapes before. Okay, so congruent means they're all the exact same shape and size. But depending on how they're marked, we have what are called corresponding parts. And those are the sides or angles that are congruent to each other. So each of the sides with 1 tick mark. So side XW is congruent to side WI. These each have 2 tick marks. So side XY is congruent to side IH. And these each have 3 tick marks. So side WY is congruent to side WH. And notice there is a segment symbol over the top of them. If you don't put the segment symbol, it will be marked incorrect. Okay, then I look to see which angles are marked congruent. These 2 angles are marked congruent, but there's actually 8 angle W's, so I can't just say angle W. Angle XWY is congruent to angle HWI. Then these each have 2 arcs. So angle X is congruent to angle I, and these each have 3 arcs, so angle Y is congruent to angle H. So the congruent statement, the first triangle doesn't matter, so I just said triangle WXY. But when you name the second triangle, you have to make sure you follow all the markings the exact same way. So the second triangle has to be named WIH. Alright, and the next one, we look at this side is marked with 1 tick mark, but you actually have to name it. Side JK is congruent to side JK. These each have 2 tick marks, so side JU and side JI are congruent. These each have 3 tick marks, so side AK and side UK are congruent. These two angles each have one arc, so angle IKJ is congruent to angle UKJ. These two angles each have two arcs, so angle IJK is congruent to angle UJK. And then these angles each have three arcs, so angle I is congruent to angle U, and I'd put U angle U, ignore the first U. Angle I is congruent to angle U. Okay. So congruence statement, again the first triangle it doesn't matter, so for the first triangle I just said KJI. But now the second triangle, you have to name it in the exact same order, so the second triangle I have to name triangle KJU. Alrighty, so we have one theorem, it's called the third angle congruence theorem, and it just basically says if you have two pairs of congruent angles in a triangle, then the third pair are also congruent, because these three have to add to 180, and these three have to add to 180. So if the first two angles are the same, then the third pair of angles must also be the same. Okay. Alright, so solve for values of the variables. Well, it just goes back to this. All these different parts are congruent. Well, if they're congruent, that means they have the same measure. So to solve for x, we know side LM is congruent to side RQ. So I can just say 2x plus 11 equals 3x minus 9. So I'm going to subtract 3x, subtract 11, get the opposite of x equals negative 20, divide by negative 1, x equals 20. Looking back at the letters, we know angle M is congruent to angle R. So I can say 2y minus 40 equals y plus 10. So subtract y, add 40, and we get y equals 50. So for B, well, I'm going to use my third angle theorem that's up here. Since we know these two angles are congruent to these two angles, then we know that angles C and G have to be congruent. So 2x equals 80 and x equals 40. And even though we're going to focus on triangles, it works for any shape. So quadrilaterals, pentagons, hexagons, anything. So the order of the letters is important. So by looking at these letters up here, I know that side BC is congruent to side RS. So 4w minus 7 equals 2w plus 13. Subtract 2w, add 7, 2w equals 20, so w equals 10. I know that angle B is congruent to angle R. So 2x plus 9 equals 49. Subtract 9, 2x equals 40. Divide by 2, x equals 20. I also know that angle D is congruent to angle T. So 2y minus 31 equals y plus 11. Subtract y, add 31, y equals 42. And I know that side ED is congruent to side UT. So 3z plus 10 equals z plus 1. Or sorry, z plus 16. It kind of cut off there. So subtract z, subtract 10, we get 2z equals 6, divide by 2z equals 3, and that finishes today's notes.